We're back. So for this week's episode of Folklore and Fairytale Friday, I wanted to do something that was slightly more spooky since we are in the spooky season. So I decided to do this episode on Korean ghosts. Now there are a lot of different types of Korean ghosts, so I wanted to go into the types, the different stories behind them, and the historical context. So without much further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Now, trigger warning, I am going to be talking about death in this episode as well as some murder cases. So if you're sensitive to anything like that, definitely, keep that in mind, or maybe watch some of my other Folklore and Fairytale Fridays, but I just want to give you guys heads up in case you're sensitive to that type of content. So in Korean, ghosts are called gwishin. By the way, I realize I have a terrible accent with a lot of things that I say. Obviously, I'm a native English speaker, so anything in another language that I say is going to probably sound a little odd. So similar to their Western counterparts, gwishin are basically restless souls, people who have died in a very tragic or an untimely way, and they still have a mission in life. Essentially, their death was some form of a tragedy. So the origin of a Korean ghost is somewhat similar to like Western ghosts. And it's actually said that the older the gwishin is, the more powerful they become. So if you encounter a very elderly gwishin, evidently they're more dangerous. Similar to a lot of other paranormal encounters, gwishin can be noted by this sensation of cold, or you have an eerie feeling, or maybe there's something going on where you hear like disembodied voices or some form of anomaly that you wouldn't normally encounter in everyday life. And a lot of times gwishin will attach themselves to more weaker or vulnerable people, maybe people that are going through their own hardships in their life, or just in general, they are more emotionally vulnerable to a gwishin. Now, one of the first mentions or documentations of Korean ghosts can actually be seen in the Tales of the Extraordinary, which is a collective of very old ancient texts in Korea. And these texts were written from poets to ancient scholars. I've mentioned him before, but Cho Chi-won is actually the author of these, and he is a noted Confucian poet and scholar back in the Shilla dynasty. So this was about 857 AD to about 900 AD is when he lived. So his story, I'm laughing because it's kind of, I don't know, thinking about someone in like ancient Korea times writing about this type of topic makes me giggle because I guess I'm super immature. But essentially his story goes, or the documentation goes, is that there once was a poet who had a little fling with two women near a gravesite, and as this poet came to in the morning, the women were gone, and evidently the women were from the grave. So that's kind of the first documentation of like ghostly apparitions or humans interacting with a ghostly other side in Korea. Although it's very short, it's kind of telling is to say like Koreans thought that there was like an afterlife, or there was a spiritual being within themselves or within people or nature, which is a common thought process back in Asia. You can actually still see some streams of that in current day thinking processes as well. Now there are a lot of haunted locations, or quote-unquote haunted locations, throughout Korea. Among the most popular is this place called the Yeongdeok House. So the Yeongdeok House is actually an abandoned seafood restaurant that was in operations around the 1980s, but even during that time it was said that there were still weird going-ons at the time, so disembodied voices or crying, or some people would say that they had seen apparitions or shadows that really shouldn't have been there. And the theory goes is that this is like a haunted burial ground from the Korean War. So this location specifically is actually where one of the biggest turning points of the Korean War was. It's actually the location of the Battle of Incheon, and it was where the UN-led forces came onto Korean shores and recaptured Seoul from communism. They were able to disrupt North Korean supplies into the area. So despite being a very risky move, this, again, like I said, was a huge turning point in the war. However, since this is thought to be the location of a very bloody battle, and a lot of people lost their lives in this location, and there might even possibly be like an unmarked mass burial ground at this site, that's why a lot of people think that the Yeongdeok house is extremely haunted. So people, like I said, will experience the voices or the cold chills or even headaches. And there are actually a lot of like supernatural shows who've gone to this location and explored and have found like really weird things happening at this location. It's 3 hours outside of Seoul, in case you're curious if you're ever in Korea. I think you can pretty much ride a bus, or if you find some way to get there, it's pretty much free roam. You can kind of walk around the area and check it out if you're into like exploring abandoned places. And actually another reason why it's said that this is a haunted location besides the Korean War is because it's thought that a young girl actually committed suicide in this location. So there's just a lot of really unfortunate happenings that occurred there. So let's go ahead and talk about some forms of Korean ghosts, because this to me was really interesting, because unlike some other cultures, Korea has different forms of ghosts that are said to have different motivations or different ways of appearing to people. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is pretty much the most common Korean ghost that you'll not only see in media and movies, but you'll also see or hear people talk about if it's a ghost. Like, I was actually talking to my mom about this content that I was coming up with, and my mom was like, oh yeah, I remember being told about this ghost when she was younger, and it was kind of like the spookiest of them all. So this ghost is the Cheonyeon gwishin, which is basically like a virgin ghost. And she is most likely depicted with a really long dress, or she's wearing a white nightgown or a white hanbok or a white sobak, which is like grieving clothes, so just like a long white gown essentially. She has long hair typically draped over her face. She's very pale and pasty looking if you're able to see her face through the hair. And Yadam, which is like a collection of ancient short stories composed by male scholars in ancient Korea. Cheonyeon gwishin are said to either have committed suicide due to forced marriage, or maybe they're marrying someone that they aren't happy with. They're involved with some type of issues with fidelity or some type of scandal, or they confess their true feelings to someone else and those feelings aren't reciprocated. So those are some of the reasons cited in Yadam which a virgin ghost could manifest. Now, because of this, the virgin ghosts are said to be crying or moaning a lot. This is kind of thought because they don't have a way to express their emotions. And it's really because historically, and I think this is very similar in a lot of different cultures, women were thought to have a particular role in not only a household, but in ancient Korea. And if they strayed outside of that mold, it was really looked down upon. So for example, like I mentioned, the virgin ghost is often depicted with long hair kind of draped over her face. Well, actually back in ancient Korea, having your hair up and pinned was thought to be a thing that married women did, so wives wore their hair up. Back in the Joseon dynasty, the most important people in a woman's life was her father, her husband, and her sons. And essentially her life and her role was to serve these figures in her life. This was a concept called samjeongjido, and the 4 fundamental virtues a proper Korean woman should have had during this time was number 1, virtuousness. Number 2, proper talking etiquette. Number 3, domestic skills. And number 4, delicate features. So you can kind of see a woman's role in her household. It's very, obviously to us nowadays, it seems very condensed, but that was the reality that women during this time faced. So you can kind of see that depicted in the virgin ghost. Her life and the reason she became a ghost is essentially revolving around tragedy in her household with men. Obviously, keep in mind, men wrote these documentations in ancient scripts, so they kind of were able to say whatever they thought a virgin ghost is, or the supernatural superstition surrounding all of this. Now, a lot of times, if anything had befallen like a village or maybe someone was sick, it could be thought that maybe they were being haunted by an angry or evil virgin ghost, because maybe the virgin ghost was jealous of something that this person had in life, or she was taking out her grievances with her human life against a village, or maybe against a particular family, or maybe someone who wronged her during her mortal life. So there's a folktale that essentially goes, a woman was in her home and she could hear a scholar reading aloud. Now during the Joseon dynasty, evidently when you just read aloud. So she could hear the scholar reading aloud, and she was really captivated by his voice and his cadence, and just really fascinated by him. So she found herself listening to him every day and slowly but surely falling in love with him. Finally, one day she kind of snaps and couldn't take it anymore and ran next door to profess her love for the scholar. I'm sure he was very taken aback, like, excuse me, who are you? But he essentially not only rejected her, but he insulted her. And not being able to handle being insulted by what I guess she thought was the love of her life and hadn't been rejected, which was a huge no-no back in the day. Like, if you were rejected for professing your love being a woman, like, it should have been the other way around. It should have been a man professing his love for you. So it was like a double doozy, if you will, as far as like etiquette. She felt she really had no other options or reason to live, so she ended up committing suicide and unfortunately taking her own life. After all this has happened, the scholar finds for the rest of his life he experiences very bad luck, disease, everything that could go wrong essentially goes wrong in his life. It's said that the reason behind this is because the girl that professed his love to him, her love to him, haunted him for the rest of his life. So that's kind of an interesting little segue into my next topic about pacifying a virgin ghost, because essentially it's thought the way to prevent like bad luck associated with a virgin ghost is to soothe them or pacify them in some way, shape, or form. I guess another little warning for those of you guys who might be younger, it's gonna get like a little sexual, if you will. I'll keep it pretty PG, but another little warning here. So I actually didn't make this connection until I started doing research for this video. Have you guys ever heard of the notorious penis park in Korea? It's the Haesundae Park in Samcheok, and it's essentially a presentation of phallic-shaped statues to appease a virgin ghost. So this whole park is actually like built to satiate and soothe the virgin ghost, because one way to appease them is essentially, I guess, build phallic objects in their honor because they're a virgin ghost. Wink, wink, if you make my connection. So the thinking behind this is actually based on the legend of Baowi. And the story goes there was a fisherman who went out to sea, and he was busy harvesting seaweed and catching fish, and he had a woman with him, and not wanting to burden her with his daily duties, he decides to leave her on a rock while he goes out and does what he needs to do. Well, during this time, as he goes back out to sea, a vicious storm rolls in, and when he goes back to collect this woman that he left on this rock, she was gone. And unfortunately, she drowned waiting for this fisherman to come back and retrieve her. It's said that after this tragic accident occurred, the village in the area was experiencing a very slow season with fish. No one was really able to catch anything, and they were really struggling trying to understand what was going on. One day, it just so happens that another fisherman decides to urinate in the sea, and all of a sudden, they're able to catch a lot of fish. So it's thought that the woman who died on a ghost became a virgin ghost when she drowned, and upon seeing the man urinate, the sight of his appeased her so much that she allowed the village to catch fish again. So the catch went back up. So because of this, I guess the logic was, well, if one of those was great, why don't we build a whole park? So that's actually the origin of that park in Korea. And like I said, I had seen tourist pictures and I'd heard about it, and I always kind of thought it was odd, I think like most people, because it just doesn't really, I don't know, when I think about going to Korea and a penis park, those two don't really compute in my mind, but I was like, it's kind of kitschy, like the tourist attraction, but now having understood the story behind it, it actually makes total sense. And they actually have a whole shrine built for Baowi, and they have a whole ritual that occurs, I believe, yearly with shamans to kind of wish away the bad spirits and kind of bring in good luck for the village and the island. I guess the way sometimes to satiate a virgin ghost is to do that, but there's also another way to satiate a virgin ghost if you think that that's what's been plaguing your family or yourself with bad luck or misfortune. And that is actually holding a soul wedding, or what is called a soul wedding, which this is also actually a shamanistic ritual as well. And essentially what the process of a soul wedding is finding what's called a bachelor ghost and having a ritual in the afterlife for the virgin ghost and the bachelor ghost to essentially get married, so the virgin ghost is no longer a virgin ghost. A bachelor ghost, by the way, is called gwishin, and again, you don't see them a lot in folklore, more times than not, you'll see virgin ghosts mentioned. And like I was talking about earlier in the video, I have a strange feeling it's because the people who historically documented all of these stories, or the storytellers themselves, were men. Currently, even to modern day, soul weddings are still a thing. So soul weddings are normally held when the families of the person that passed away, they hold them in honor of their loved ones. So the living family, in a sense, arranges this marriage or union in the afterlife for their lost family member. They'll either take like a picture or maybe a doll or a straw, figure, or something that represents the loved one that passed away. So some of the modern day examples of this can actually be seen in some of the victims of Hom Gun-woo, which is one of the most notorious serial killers in Korea. I can actually probably make a separate video on him if you guys are curious about this kind of stuff. It's more true crime, but it's actually very tragic and sad. And essentially he was the cause of one of the biggest mass murders ever in Korea's modern history. And this guy is insane, obviously. Like, he literally just snapped one day and just went across Korea and murdered a bunch of people, unfortunately. So some of the families of his victims have actually held soul weddings because, unfortunately, the victims of him span from a lot of different ages. So there were very young victims and also very old victims. Another example of soul weddings is actually for Hyuna Unfortunately, her murder is still a mystery, and she was a very young girl who was attending middle school at the time when her murder took place. So her murder actually was fairly recent. It occurred in 2003, and when her body was discovered several days after she had gone missing, her fingernails and her toenails were crudely painted red, and so whoever murdered her for some reason decided to paint her fingernails, and unfortunately her body was discovered in an underground pipe. Her soul wedding was organized by her family and was held in the Hyungdongsa temple, and they actually arranged her marriage with another family whose son had passed away in the military. To me, the concept of soul weddings, it's obviously very tragic and upsetting with everything surrounding it, but in a sense it's actually kind of beautiful that it can bring peace to some of the families, and it's something that was practiced historically in Korea and still to this day is currently something that's practiced in some families. Now that we've talked at length about virgin ghost, another common form of ghost is called gwishin. Now, mu means water in Korean, so these are water ghosts. Now, like the name implies, these ghosts are often found in bodies of water. Now, these types of ghosts are kind of like sirens in the sense that they lure their victims to the water, and then when people get close enough, the water ghost grab them and pull them into the water and drown them. Water ghosts can be motivated by a lot of different things. Some people say water ghosts are motivated because they're lonely, so they're looking for some type of human interaction or interaction in general in dragging someone else down and essentially making them a water ghost. It actually is a concept called gwishin 작전, which essentially means like pulling you down with them or like sabotaging you in a sense. It's like a saying. Besides maybe looking for companionship, gwishin are also said to kill, maybe to replace their soul with another soul, so it, I guess, saves them from being a water ghost, or they're trying to enslave the person's soul, or they're just in general like very malevolent and evil. Now, it's said that if you see like black weeds in the water, or if you see like hair floating in the water, you're also supposed to stay away from that because that's supposed to be a water ghost. And there are places actually throughout Korea which it's said that more water ghosts tend to reside. One modern day example of a location like this is actually the Hongcheon River. Now, this river actually has a lot of different monikers because this is the site where a lot of people drown. It's said that, I believe back in 2012, there was something like 20 deaths involving this river, so it's even referred to as like the evil river or the river of death or the river of the devil. Now, because of this, they've even had to install 23 life jacket stations that are free for people who visit the river because so many drownings have occurred. Now, reason for a lot of these drownings is it's actually thought that this is maybe a river where a lot of gwishin reside. So they might be pulling people to the depths of the river to their deaths. Similar to this, another location, which is a very popular location that it said a lot of water ghosts reside, is actually Jeju Island. Now, Jeju Island, despite it now basically being Korea's version of Hawaii, it's a major tourist destination. A lot of honeymooners even go to Jeju Island for their honeymoon, and a lot of visitors go there to explore the different hiking trails and the beautiful scenery and the green tea plantations that they have in the area. But Jeju Island is actually steeped in a lot of tragedy. Now, again, this occurred around the time of the Korean War, when Korea was dealing with a lot of communism and the government was trying to keep that at bay. Now, from 1948 to 1949, right before the official start of the Korean War, there was something called the Jeju Uprising. Now, before I go into the Jeju Uprising, I'm going to go ahead and hop off camera really quickly and apply my eyeliner and lashes. I want to give this time in history the justice it deserves. And I know I won't be able to do that by, applying liner to my eyes, which requires a little bit of attention. So I'll be right back. So the Jeju Uprising was actually a government initiative to suppress communism in the area, or what they thought was a communist uprising at the time. And unfortunately, during this time, it's thought that anywhere between 13,000 to 30,000 people who lived in Jeju were ultimately killed. Now, this means that a lot of most likely innocent people, women, children, villagers, died and actually were pretty much or literally executed. It's actually said that there were mass executions that essentially occurred where current-day Jeju International Airport is sitting. According to the United States Military Advisor Group to the Republic of Korea, on October 2nd, 1949, 249 people were actually executed at this site. Soon after that, another mass execution occurred of about 500 people. So it's thought that there are as many as 700 to 800 people that were executed at this site specifically, and most likely buried. Now, in 2007, a full-scale excavation occurred at the Jeju International Airport, and it was actually completed in 2009, and this was essentially an effort to exhume all the bodies in this area and give them a proper burial. 239 bodies were recovered, including 1,000 lost articles. But despite this, it's thought that there are still maybe even thousands of bodies under the Jeju International Airport, but because they don't want to disrupt the airport, because it's obviously still an operating airport and this would dramatically interrupt the day-to-day operations, the burial still exists there. Now, because of Jeju Island's tragic history with this, and I'm sure there's other very tragic historical events that have happened in this location just because of the tumultuous history of Korea, it's said that Jeju Island is overrun with gwishin. Now, due to the mysticism across the island, there are about 400 shrines built in honor of the spirits or the ghosts or whatever you would call them, or even dokebi, that are there for satiating these different spiritual or supernatural entities. And the rituals are performed by mudang or shamans. Now, we talked a lot about ghosts who have had a tragic end to their lives, or something that has occurred that has led them to become a spirit in the afterlife. But there are also Korean ghosts in their folklore that essentially exist for no particular reason, and there's still a lot of mystery around them, and they're considered to be extremely dangerous. And one of these ghosts include the Tagyal ghost, or the egg ghost. Now, it sounds kind of, weird in a sense, like an egg ghost, but it actually makes sense. So an egg ghost is essentially a ghost that has no features. They have a smooth face. They don't possess any eyes, a nose, a mouth, ears, anything. It's essentially just a smooth, featureless face, but they have like the body of a human most of the time. Sometimes they're actually depicted without legs or arms. Those are the really odd ones, but most of the time the egg ghosts just don't have a face. Now, these are said to be the most dangerous form of Korean ghosts because there's not really any motivation for them. And it's said that if you encounter one or see one, you're basically doomed to imminent death. And no one has survived an encounter with an egg ghost. Anyone who's encountered one has obviously died, so there's no one to really relay any story or knowledge about the egg ghost. Now, because egg ghosts don't have any tether to the mortal world, like they don't have any relatives or family members or anything they're thought to be very emotionless and cold. And they really do lack that substance that gives people humanity, or even sometimes ghosts a bit of humanity. Egg ghosts don't have them. Now, one of the folktales that I was able to find that involves the concept of an egg ghost is about a young man who spent a long day in the market and a long day at work and was traveling along a path on his way home. Now, he takes this path pretty much every day, but it was a little bit later at night than he particularly would walk this path, and so he was feeling a little nervous, a little spooked. He'd heard of some other fellow villagers encountering egg ghosts along this path, so he was already kind of on edge and walking along a forest as he's going. So as he's walking, he notices ahead of him there are two figures, so he feels a little bit better knowing that there are other people walking the same path, and he just, it's like, okay, talking himself down, as we all would, I believe. Like, okay, everything's fine, we're good. Now, these figures that he noticed, as he's watching these figures that are walking ahead of him, he notices they're starting to go down a path that essentially leads to a cliff side. So, worried that they might be in danger, he calls ahead and warns them of the path that they're heading down. And upon hearing him shout, they turn around and approach closer. Now, the young man was pretty weirded out by this, like, what's going on? But as they approached him and came a bit closer, he noticed they didn't have any features. Their face was completely smooth, and they didn't have anything to say. They weren't making any noise, just very mysterious. And the story essentially ends with the young man's death a couple days later in his village after encountering the egg ghost. So maybe this is kind of like a symbol, an ominous symbol. In some cultures, it's like a crow or an owl, or black cat, I think sometimes can mean imminent death or oncoming death. So maybe that's like the Korean equivalent of an egg ghost, but either way, they are not something that you want to mess with or encounter. And like I said, anyone who has encountered them ends up dead. So there's not a lot known about them besides some of the stories behind them. Now, the last ghost that I'm going to be talking about in this video is kind of an odd ghost, but I think it breeds on some of our worst fears, which I don't know about you guys, is going to the bathroom at night, just because, I don't know, it's like a dark hole that you're sitting on, you're very vulnerable, and the mirrors I don't like to look at night. Like when I wash my hands, I'm always like not looking at my reflection in the mirror. But this kind of, I believe, preys on that natural human fear. And this ghost is the 화장실 ghost, which essentially is like a toilet ghost or like a bathroom ghost, I guess, if you were to directly translate it. Now, 화장실 ghost, a lot of times they're pictured in like a squat toilet, if you guys have ever been to Korea, and I'm sure actually I've seen them in a lot of other countries, like a squat toilet. It's not very common here in the West. Essentially, it's like a nice hole in the ground, and you would just squat over it, do your business. So a lot of times they're depicted coming out of that hole from the ground, and upon trying to escape, when you see the hand, upon being trapped in the 화장실 with this ghost, the ghost will ask you, do you prefer red toilet paper or blue toilet paper? Now, your options are obviously very small, and unfortunately both your options pretty much lead to the same thing. If you were to pick the red toilet paper, it said that the ghost will skin you alive and leave you bloody and raw until you die. Or if you choose the blue toilet paper, you are suffocated to death until you turn blue and die. So it's a very not great situation to be in. Now again, like I said, I think this ghost is really based off a lot of primal fear a lot of us have. And I don't like the color of this lipstick. Let me change this. And before modern day Korea, and obviously a lot of other areas, your bathroom was not a part of your house. It was like located in an outhouse. So I could imagine during this time, like having to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, trying to hold it, but realizing you need to go, and then having to go outside in the dark where it's very quiet, and then you close yourself in this little outhouse where you're very vulnerable. I could see where the origins of this ghost comes from, and I'm not gonna lie, it definitely gives me pause whenever I go to the bathroom at night. Now I have something else to worry about besides my reflection in the mirror. Alright guys, so I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Folklore and Fairytale Friday. If you guys want to check out some previous episodes, episode number 1 was on dokebi, which are essentially Korean goblins. Episode number 2 was on the Kumiho, which is the mysterious and spiritual nine-tailed fox. Like I've said in my past videos, definitely leave me some feedback in the comment section down below. It's been very valuable for me to read your guys' feedback, see what you guys like, what you maybe don't like, and even seeing the like to dislike ratio has been super helpful. So if you guys want me to continue doing this past the month of October, I'm gonna need to see a lot of likes on this video and comments, because these videos are a lot of time and energy and research, and they're obviously quite a lot longer than my normal content, so it'd be really nice to hear what you guys have to say. And I do take recommendations from the comment section. I'm actually planning one on a recommendation you guys left in last week's video, so definitely leave it down in the comment section if you guys have a particular folklore or fairy tale you want me to go more in depth on. I am planning on branching outside of Korea. It was just, since I talk about Korean beauty, I felt like it was a natural transition, so I'm happy to explore other cultures because that's why I like doing these. I feel like it explains a lot of context for cultures and maybe why certain cultures or countries think a certain way. So it's been really fun, and I hope you guys enjoyed. As always, I hope you guys are happy and healthy, and don't forget to rate, comment, subscribe, share with your friends and family, hit that notification bell, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye guys!